Every empire is born from collapse. Before there was a man called QIN SHI HUANG. Before there was an empire that called itself all under heaven. There was a world that had already begun to break apart. A world where old rules no longer restrained violence. And ancient traditions could no longer protect those who believed in them. This was China during the Warring States period. For more than 2 centuries, the land had been locked in a continuous cycle of war. Not a single, decisive conflict, but an endless sequence of campaigns, alliances, betrayals, and annihilations. States rose only to fall. Victories were temporary. Defeats were final. The Zhou order had collapsed in everything but name. Kings still existed, rituals were still performed, and court scholars still recited ancient texts. But the authority behind them was gone. Power no longer flowed from tradition. It flowed from armies. The land was divided into rival states, Qin, Zhao, Wei, Han, Qi, Chu, Yan, each convinced that survival required dominance, and that compromise was merely a slower form of death. Borders shifted constantly. Cities were erased. Entire populations were uprooted or slaughtered. War was no longer an event. It was the environment. A child born into this world did not grow up learning peace. They learned instability. They learned that tomorrow was uncertain. That rulers could change overnight. And that mercy was unreliable. Generations lived and died knowing nothing but mobilization, conscription, and loss. The old moral frameworks were still spoken of, but they no longer matched reality. Confucian scholars preached benevolence, ritual, and harmony. They spoke of virtuous rulers who governed through moral example. But these ideas belonged to an earlier age, one where violence had limits. And war was constrained by shared norms. In the Warring States world, such limits no longer existed. Armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Battles were not contests of honor, but calculations of attrition. Cities that resisted were not negotiated with. They were annihilated. Men were executed. Women and children were enslaved or displaced. The goal was no longer victory, but elimination. The scale of violence had outgrown the moral systems meant to contain it. As war intensified, trust evaporated. Rulers trusted no one. Not ministers, not generals, not even family members. Assassinations were common. Coups were routine. Loyalty was fragile, often bought, and easily reversed. To rule meant to survive constant suspicion. In this world, weakness was not tragic, it was fatal. And yet, despite the brutality, something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The old aristocratic order was dying. Bloodlines that had ruled for centuries were being wiped out by men of lesser birth but greater efficiency. Social mobility, once unthinkable, became a byproduct of mass warfare. Merit began to matter more than ancestry, not because of ideology, but because war demanded results. States that clung to tradition weakened. States that adapted survived. This was not a philosophical transformation. It was a mechanical one. War stripped society down to what worked and what did not. Anything inefficient was discarded. Anything ineffective was punished. The human cost was immense. Fields were left untended. Famines followed campaigns. Refugees moved endlessly across borders, carrying stories of massacres and destroyed cities. Entire regions became depopulated. Life expectancy fell. Trauma accumulated, generation after generation. The land itself seemed exhausted. And yet, no state could stop fighting. Because to stop was to fall behind. And to fall behind was to be conquered. This was the paradox of the age. Everyone knew the system was destroying itself. And yet no one could escape it. It was within this environment, violent, unstable, exhausted, that a new type of ruler would emerge, not one shaped by ideals of harmony, but by the cold mathematics of power. A ruler who would look at chaos not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. But before that ruler could exist, the world had to be prepared for him. Prepared to accept order at any cost. Prepared to exchange freedom for stability. Prepared to endure cruelty in exchange for peace. The Warring States period was not merely a time of conflict. It was a long process of psychological conditioning. A society being pushed, slowly and relentlessly, toward the conclusion that only absolute authority could end absolute war. By the time Qin Shi Huang would rise, the world was already ready. Not because it desired him, but because it could no longer survive without someone like him. Before the name Qin became a nightmare that haunted the entire world. It was little more than a harsh sound carried by the winds of the western frontier. A state that, when mentioned, often provoked quiet smiles of contempt among the Central Plains, not because they were unfamiliar with Qin, but because they believed Qin was unworthy of being counted among the centers of civilization. The land of Qin was dry and unforgiving. Winds swept across open plains carrying dust and grit. Winters were long and bitter. Summers short and harsh. There were no vast fertile lowlands like those in the east. No dense river networks to sustain abundant agriculture. Here, survival came before philosophy. Endurance came before refinement. To the east lay the wealthy states of the Central Plains, Zhao, Wei, Qi, Chu, lands where ritual and music flourished, where aristocrats traced their bloodlines and competed over ancestral prestige. Power there was wrapped in ceremony. Violence was hidden behind etiquette. And war, no matter how brutal, was spoken of in elegant language. Qin was different. In Qin, war required no disguise. It existed openly, woven into daily life. The people of Qin were not trained to speak beautifully. They were trained to hold a spear, to ride a horse, and to kill in order to defend their land. The harshness of the environment left no room for softness. Hardness was not a virtue, it was a necessity. And so, in the eyes of the eastern states, Qin was crude, barbaric, a peripheral outcast beyond the borders of true civilization. Scholars from the Central Plains rarely traveled west, and if they did, they regarded the journey as a personal degradation. Stories of Qin were told with irony, as reminders that real culture and legitimate authority could never emerge from a land of dust and wind. But this contempt did not weaken Qin. It did something far more dangerous. It planted a deep and persistent sense of humiliation, a quiet awareness of being looked down upon. And from that awareness, a powerful desire began to grow, not to persuade, but to conquer. When a state is born into disdain, it faces two possible paths. It can seek acceptance, or it can seek domination. Qin chose the second path, not because it was inherently more cruel than others, but because circumstance allowed no alternative. For Qin, mere existence was already a struggle. To the west were nomadic tribes, always ready to raid and plunder. To the east were wealthy states, constantly seeking to contain Qin through alliances and political pressure. Qin stood trapped between two forces, and in such a position, weakness meant extinction. The people of Qin grew up with the understanding that the world beyond their borders was not kind. No one would protect them. No one would pity them. And if they failed to grow strong, they would simply disappear. This understanding seeped into every household, every village, every generation. It forged a society that valued strength above all else, and measured success solely by survival. While the states of the Central Plains debated ritual, morality, and tradition, Qin quietly prepared for a different future. A future in which law would replace lineage, where merit in battle mattered more than noble birth, and where loyalty belonged not to family clans, but to the state itself. The contempt Qin faced from the outside became an unexpected catalyst. It forced the state to confront reality without illusion. There was no glorious past to rely on, no external recognition to seek. There was only one viable path forward, to become impossible to ignore. From this land dismissed as barbaric, a new model of governance began to take shape, one that did not rely on moral sentiment, one that did not depend on ethical persuasion, but one built on efficiency, a system that viewed people as resources, society as a machine, and war as a tool for restructuring order. The earliest seeds of legalist thought took root here not because Qin admired cruelty, but because Qin understood that without becoming colder than the world around it, it would not survive. And throughout history, the societies that endure the longest are often those that learn to be indifferent to their own pain. From the perspective of the Central Plains, Qin remained an outsider, but within its borders, transformation had already begun. Quietly, patiently, irreversibly, the contempt poured upon Qin was being stored away, day by day, as a historical debt. One day, that debt would be collected, not through argument, not through justification, but through armies, through law, and through a new order built upon fear felt across the entire world. And when that day came, no one would laugh at the name Qin again. If Qin was the body, then legalism was its nervous system. And the man who carved that system into flesh and bone was Shang Yang. When Shang Yang arrived in Qin, he did not come bearing poetry, morality, or ancient wisdom. He came with a diagnosis. A cold one. He believed that society was sick, not because people were evil, but because they were predictable. People, he argued, respond to incentives. They obey when rewards are clear. They submit when punishments are certain. And they collapse into chaos when rules are flexible. To Shang Yang, moral persuasion was unreliable, tradition was inefficient, and compassion, when applied to governance, was a form of weakness. In the world of the warring states, he believed only one thing truly mattered: control. Qin listened. Not because Shang Yang was kind, but because his ideas worked. At the time, Qin was still viewed as inferior by the Eastern states, militarily capable, but socially crude. What Shang Yang offered was not refinement, but transformation. His reforms began with a simple, terrifying principle: the law must be absolute, and no one, noble or commoner, could stand above it. Hereditary privilege was dismantled. Aristocratic rank no longer came from blood, but from service, specifically service in war, kill enemies, gain titles, fail, and lose status. Families were reorganized. Communities were made collectively responsible for crimes. If one person broke the law, everyone around them paid the price. Fear was no longer a side effect of governance. It became the mechanism. Punishments were harsh, deliberately so: mutilation, forced labor, execution, not hidden, not softened, but made visible, so that the lesson would travel faster than mercy ever could. Shang Yang understood something fundamental. Pain teaches faster than words. Under his system, the state did not ask people to be virtuous. It demanded that they be useful. Farmers who produced grain were rewarded. Soldiers who killed were promoted. Everyone else was expendable. This was not chaos. It was order, of a new kind. An order built not on trust, but on predictability. Not on loyalty, but on fear. Not on morality, but on results. And slowly, Qin began to change. It became more disciplined, more centralized, more lethal. The other states still laughed. They called Qin cruel, inhuman. They did not yet realize that cruelty, when systematized, becomes power. Shang Yang's reforms did not ask society to change. They compelled it. Once the law was declared absolute, it did not stop at the palace gates. It moved outward, into villages, farms, families, and bodies. The state no longer governed from above. It penetrated downward, reshaping daily life with relentless precision. People were no longer treated as individuals. They were counted, categorized, and monitored. Households were reorganized into collective units. 5 families, 10 families. If one member committed a crime, the rest were punished alongside them. Guilt became contagious. This system did not rely on trust. It destroyed it. Neighbors watched neighbors. Brothers watched brothers. Silence itself became suspicious. To report wrongdoing was rewarded. To conceal it was a crime. Fear rewired social behavior. Marriage, migration, occupation. Nothing escaped regulation. Farmers were bound to the land. Merchants were restricted. Scholars were marginalized. Only two paths led upward: agriculture and war. Produce grain. Kill enemies. Everything else was noise. Punishments were not proportional. They were exemplary. The goal was not justice, but deterrence. A single execution was meant to prevent 1,000 crimes. Bodies were marked, mutilated, displayed. Pain became a language everyone understood. What emerged was not chaos, but uniformity, a population stripped of ambiguity, predictable, obedient, efficient. The old aristocracy collapsed under this pressure. Privilege without utility was erased. Titles became transactional. Loyalty became contractual. For the first time, the state did not negotiate with society. It redesigned it. And Qin grew stronger. Not admired. Not loved. But feared. By the end of Shang Yang's reforms, Qin was no longer a state in the traditional sense. It was a machine. Every component had a function. Every citizen a role. Every law a lever. The purpose of the system was singular: expansion. Agriculture fed the army. Law disciplined the population. Fear eliminated resistance. Nothing was accidental. Unlike other states, Qin did not pretend that morality guided power. Power was openly mechanical. Outcomes mattered. Efficiency mattered. Human cost was irrelevant. This clarity gave Qin an advantage. Its armies moved faster. Its logistics were tighter. Its command structure was centralized. Orders were obeyed without debate, without hesitation. While other states argued, Qin acted. And slowly, inexorably, the balance of the warring states shifted. What Shang Yang built outlived him. Even after his brutal execution, his system remained, not because it was loved, but because it worked. The machine no longer needed its architect. It would soon find its operator. A child born into this system, raised by suspicion, hardened by law. His name would be Ying Zheng. And when he took control of the machine, it would not merely conquer states. It would redefine what an empire was allowed to be. Every machine eventually requires an operator. For Qin, that operator would be a child. His name was Ying Zheng. He was born not into peace, but into danger, not into certainty, but into suspicion. From the beginning, his life was shaped by forces beyond his control: politics, fear, and survival. Ying Zheng spent part of his childhood as a hostage in the state of Zhao. Not as a guest, not as a diplomat, but as leverage. His existence was a guarantee of Qin's obedience. If Qin misstepped, the child would pay the price. Life in Zhao was hostile. The people knew who he was. A prince of Qin, son of the Western state they despised and feared. Insults were common. Violence was always close. Protection was minimal. Trust was non-existent. A child raised under such conditions does not learn empathy. He learns caution. He learns silence. He learns how to observe without reacting. Every word could be dangerous. Every gesture misinterpreted. Every weakness exploited. Fear became routine. His mother, Zhao Ji, was herself entangled in court intrigue, surrounded by ambition and manipulation. She could offer little stability. The household was not a refuge, it was another battlefield. In this environment, Ying Zheng learned a crucial lesson early. Power is the only form of safety. Not friendship. Not morality. Not affection. Only power. When Ying Zheng finally returned to Qin, he was no longer an ordinary child. He carried with him a deep mistrust of others and an instinctive understanding of political danger. At the age of 13, he ascended the throne. In name, real power rested elsewhere, in the hands of regents, ministers, and factions competing behind the curtain. Chief among them was Lu Buwei, a merchant-turned-statesman whose influence shaped the early years of Ying Zheng's reign. But the boy was watching. He watched how alliances shifted, how loyalty dissolved, how authority was borrowed and taken back. He learned that titles meant little without force behind them. And slowly, the child began to harden. He did not rebel openly. He waited. Because in Qin, patience was not weakness. It was strategy. Power rarely announces itself openly. More often, it arrives disguised as service. Lu Buwei understood this better than anyone. He was not born a noble. He was not raised for command. He was a merchant, trained to measure risk, calculate profit, and recognize opportunity where others saw uncertainty. When Lu Buwei first encountered the royal house of Qin, he did not see legitimacy. He saw leverage. He saw a fragile succession, a neglected prince, and a system that could be manipulated by those patient enough to pull its strings. Lu Buwei's greatest investment was not gold. It was Ying Yiren, a minor Qin prince held hostage in Zhao. To Lu Buwei, the prince was not a man. He was a future asset. Through bribery, persuasion, and calculated generosity, Lu Buwei reshaped fate. Ying Yiren returned to Qin, ascended the throne, and became King Xuanshang. Lu Buwei followed, not as ruler, but as shadow. When King Xuanshang died prematurely, his son Ying Zheng was still a child. And Lu Buwei stepped forward. Officially, he was chancellor. In reality, he was the state. Every decree passed through him. Every appointment bore his approval. Every policy reflected his interest. The boy king sat on the throne. But the merchant held the ledger of power. And for a time, the arrangement worked. Behind every controlled system, there are fractures. In Qin, that fracture lay within the palace itself. Zhao Ji, mother of Ying Zheng, had never truly belonged to the world of rigid law and discipline that Qin was becoming. She came from a background shaped by intrigue, survival, and emotional volatility. As Queen Dowager, she held influence but not authority, visibility, but not control. And that imbalance created danger. Lu Buwei understood this. He feared Zhao Ji's unpredictability as much as he depended on her position. To protect his own power, he sought to distract her, to occupy her attention, to neutralize her. The solution he chose was a man named Lao Ai. Lao Ai was not a noble, not a general, not a scholar. He was selected for a different reason entirely. He was presented to Zhao Ji as a eunuch, harmless, controllable, irrelevant. It was a lie. Lao Ai was no eunuch. He was a man placed deliberately into the most intimate space of the royal court. And what began as manipulation soon became obsession. Zhao Ji took Lao Ai as a lover. Children were born in secret. Inside the palace of Qin, built on law, fear, and discipline, an alternate power structure began to grow, one based not on legality, but on blood. Lao Ai was no longer content with secrecy. Emboldened by Zhao Ji's protection and intoxicated by proximity to power, he began to imagine a future where he ruled not from the shadows, but openly. He gathered followers, armed retainers, loyalists within the palace guard. His ambition grew faster than his caution. The conspiracy took shape quietly. If Ying Zheng could be removed, or replaced, the throne could be claimed in the name of Zhao Ji's children. It was a direct threat to the state. And Ying Zheng was watching. He had learned, long ago, what betrayal looked like. He recognized the signs, the whispers, the sudden movements, the tension beneath ceremony. When the plot finally surfaced, it did not result in negotiation. It resulted in violence. Lao Ai's rebellion was crushed with overwhelming force. His followers were slaughtered. His entire clan was exterminated. His children were executed. Zhao Ji was stripped of power and confined. No mercy was extended. No exception made. The palace was cleansed. And in the blood that followed, Ying Zheng learned one final lesson of childhood. Power must be taken completely, or it will be taken from you. The palace coup did not begin with chaos. It began with silence. After the fall of Lao Ai, the court of Qin appeared calm. Ceremonies continued. Decrees were issued. Officials bowed as they always had. But beneath the surface, power was shifting, quietly, deliberately. Ying Zheng was no longer a child. He had seen betrayal up close. He had watched how shadows ruled in place of kings. And he had learned that authority, once shared, is never truly yours. The first move was separation. Lu Buwei was not accused openly. Not yet. Instead, his influence was reduced piece by piece. Appointments were reassigned. Access was limited. Loyalists were transferred away from the capital. Power was not attacked directly, it was starved. Then came the accusation. The scandal of Lao Ai provided the pretext. Lu Buwei's involvement, real or perceived, was enough. He was stripped of office, exiled from court, removed from the center he once controlled. The merchant who had bought a king was dismissed by one. Soon after, Lu Buwei died in exile. Whether by despair or poison, the result was the same. The shadow was gone. What followed was not reconciliation, but consolidation. Ying Zheng purged the court. Old factions were dismantled. Ministers were reassessed not for loyalty, but for usefulness. Fear returned, not as chaos, but as order. From this moment on, power in Qin had a single owner. There would be no regents, no intermediaries, no hidden hands. The machine built by Shang Yang now had a master, and Ying Zheng understood it perfectly. He did not rule through affection. He ruled through control. Every lesson of his childhood, hostagehood, humiliation, betrayal, hardened into doctrine. Trust was dangerous. Mercy was optional. Law was absolute. The king was no longer a symbol. He was the system. And with the palace silenced, Qin turned outward, toward conquest, toward unification, toward empire. Power, once secured, demands movement. For Ying Zheng, consolidation was never the end. It was preparation. With the palace silenced and authority concentrated into a single will, Qin no longer looked inward. It turned outward, toward the fractured states of the Central Plains. The machine was ready. Years of legalist reform had reshaped Qin into something unprecedented. Its population was registered, disciplined, and conditioned. Its economy was oriented toward war. Its laws produced obedience with mechanical reliability. Other states still relied on negotiation. Qin relied on execution. Mobilization was swift. Orders moved from the capital to the frontier without resistance. Armies assembled not as feudal levies, but as standardized units, trained, supplied, and commanded by the state alone. This was not war as ritual. It was war as process. The first targets were not chosen at random. Ying Zheng and his generals understood hierarchy. Weak states would fall first, creating momentum and fear. Han stood in the path. Surrounded, undersupplied, politically isolated, Han was the smallest of the major states, and the most vulnerable. Qin did not negotiate its surrender. It demonstrated inevitability. Fortresses were encircled, supply lines severed, resistance collapsed not because of a single decisive battle, but because survival became mathematically impossible. When Han fell, it sent a signal across the Central Plains. Qin was no longer a border threat. It was an advancing force. Other states watched, and hesitated. Some fortified. Some sought alliances. Some prepared assassins. None were ready for the scale of what was coming. Ying Zheng did not rush. He advanced deliberately. Each conquest fed the next. Captured populations were reorganized. Lands were absorbed. Laws were imposed without negotiation. There was no integration phase. Only continuation. This was not conquest for glory. It was conquest for completion. And it had begun. After Han fell, fear spread faster than armies. The states of the Central Plains understood what Qin represented. but understanding did not equal readiness. Old rivalries remained, distrust lingered, and Qin exploited this hesitation with precision. The next targets were Zhao and Wei. Zhao was not weak, its armies were experienced, its generals respected. It had resisted Qin before, and paid for it in blood. Entire Zhao armies had been buried alive at Changping. The memory still haunted the land. But memory does not stop momentum. Qin did not rush Zhao. It isolated it. Alliances were disrupted. Supply routes were severed. Border pressure increased without decisive engagement. Zhao was forced to defend everywhere, until it could defend nowhere. Siege followed siege. Cities were not stormed for glory. They were starved into surrender. Time became a weapon. Hunger did what swords did not. Wei fell differently. Wei's strength had once been diplomacy and geography, but now it was compressed between enemies. Qin struck with speed, cutting through defenses before coordination could form. There was no heroic last stand. Only collapse. What united these conquests was not brutality alone, but method. Qin did not merely defeat armies. It erased states. Administrative systems were dismantled. Elites were removed or executed. Populations were registered, relocated, and absorbed. Local laws vanished overnight. Resistance became meaningless. Across the Central Plains, rulers began to realize the truth. This was not a cycle of war. It was an ending. And there would be no restoration. Empires do not fall only when armies are defeated. They fall when belief collapses. By the time Zhao and Wei were erased, the remaining states still existed, but only in form. Their walls stood. Their courts convened. Their kings issued decrees. But confidence was gone. The question was no longer if Qin would come. It was when. Across the Central Plains, rulers studied maps that no longer offered solutions. Every possible alliance had already failed. Every defensive strategy had already been tested and broken. Resistance no longer felt heroic. It felt pointless. Generals hesitated. Ministers argued. Advisors spoke in whispers, measuring every word for signs of disloyalty. Fear moved faster than information. Rumors of Qin's efficiency spread from market to market, from camp to camp. Not stories of glory. Stories of inevitability. Qin did not need to fight everywhere. Its reputation did the work. Cities surrendered without battle. Garrisons opened gates to avoid annihilation. Kings delayed decisions until decisions were no longer theirs to make. This was conquest without combat. A form of domination more complete than violence. The warring state system had relied on balance, on the idea that no single power could overwhelm the rest. But Qin shattered that assumption. And once the illusion of balance died, the system collapsed under its own weight. Each remaining state now fought alone, not against Qin's armies, but against time. And time belonged to Qin. By the end, there was no shared will to resist, only individual calculations of survival. Officials defected. Commanders surrendered. Populations waited in silence, hoping submission would spare them. Some were spared. Many were not. What died in this moment was not just political independence. It was the belief that the old world could ever return. The Warring States era did not end with a single battle. It ended with a collective surrender of imagination. By the time Qin turned south and east, the war was already decided. What remained were not equal opponents, but unfinished tasks. Chu was the largest of the remaining states, vast in territory, rich in resources, proud of its ancient lineage. For generations, it had seen itself not as a rival to the northern states, but as a civilization apart. That belief would become its weakness. Chu's size made coordination slow. Its aristocracy resisted Qin-style discipline. Generals argued. Command chains fractured. Qin advanced not with speed, but with patience. One campaign became two. Two became many. Each defeat weakened Chu's internal cohesion. Provinces fell out of sync. Loyalty eroded. When the final blow came, it did not feel sudden. It felt overdue. Yan fell faster. Its attempt at resistance had already failed, most famously through assassination. The dagger had missed its mark, and after that failure, Yan no longer fought as a confident state. It fought as a condemned one. Qin advanced north. Cities surrendered early. The capital fell with minimal resistance. What had once been a kingdom became a district. Then there was Qi. Qi did not fight. It watched. For years, Qi had isolated itself diplomatically, believing neutrality would protect it. While others burned, Qi waited, hoping Qin would exhaust itself. But Qin did not exhaust. When Qin's armies finally arrived at Qi's borders, there was no coalition waiting, no allies, no urgency left. Qi surrendered without a battle. In that moment, the Warring States era ended. Not with a final clash, but with silence. 6 states had fallen, borders dissolved, titles vanished. What remained was a single authority, unchallenged, unquestioned, absolute. Yingzheng had not merely conquered territory. He had erased alternatives. And in doing so, he transformed conquest into something permanent. For the first time, China was not a collection of competing worlds. It was one. Victory did not bring relief. It brought a problem no ruler before had ever faced. Yingzheng had conquered all rival states, but conquest alone could not explain what came next. The old world had collapsed completely. There were no equals left to defeat, no ancient hierarchy left to inherit. There was no title sufficient for what he had become. Kings had existed before, many of them, too many. The word itself had lost weight. It belonged to the age he had just destroyed. Yingzheng rejected it. He did not want to rule as the highest king among others. He wanted to rule as something entirely new, something that could not be compared, challenged, or repeated. And so a new title was created. Huangdi, a word that fused myth and authority. Huang, evoking the legendary sovereigns of deep antiquity. D. The divine rulers who stood above humanity. Together, they formed a title that implied more than governance. It implied inevitability. Ying Zheng named himself QIN Shi Huang, the first emperor. Not first among equals. First, and alone. This was not symbolic vanity. It was structural necessity. The empire he ruled had no precedent. Its scale was too large. Its diversity too vast. Its internal contradictions too dangerous. To govern it like an old kingdom would invite fragmentation. The solution was absolute centralization. Every rival authority had to be erased, not just militarily, but conceptually. Feudal titles were abolished, hereditary domains dismantled, former kings were reduced to administrators, or removed entirely. Loyalty would no longer flow through bloodlines. It would flow directly to the throne. The emperor did not rule through tradition. He ruled through systems. Standardized laws replaced local customs. A unified bureaucracy replaced aristocratic privilege. Officials were appointed, evaluated, promoted, and punished by the state alone. No land was owned by nobles. No army belonged to generals. Everything belonged to Qin. And at its center stood the emperor, not as a man, but as a function, a node through which all authority passed. This redefinition of power was deliberate. Qin Shi Huang understood something his enemies never had. The greatest threat to empire was not rebellion from below. It was division from within. So the empire was redesigned to prevent it. Regions were redrawn into commanderies. Governors were rotated to prevent local loyalty. Military authority was separated from civil administration. Surveillance became policy. Reporting became law. The state watched itself constantly. And the emperor watched the state. To the outside world, Qin Shi Huang appeared omnipotent. To himself, he was besieged. Every decision carried the weight of collapse. Every official was a potential traitor. Every tradition was a possible crack through which the past could return. This was not paranoia. It was memory. He had grown up in a world where rulers were assassinated, courts were infiltrated, and mercy was fatal. The empire he built was a direct response to that trauma. Absolute control was not excess. It was insurance. But control alone was not enough. To endure, the empire had to think the same way everywhere. And that required something even more radical. Conquest creates territory. But territory alone does not create an empire. Qin Shi Huang understood this with unsettling clarity. The land he ruled was vast, but it was fragmented in ways that armies could not solve. People spoke differently, they wrote differently, they measured differently, they remembered the past differently. Left untouched, these differences would eventually harden into resistance. So the emperor did not merely unify land. He unified behavior. The first target was language, not speech, but writing. Across the former states, characters had evolved in divergent forms. The same word could look unfamiliar from one region to another. Documents became barriers. Orders lost precision. Authority weakened with distance. Qin abolished regional scripts. In their place, a single standardized writing system was imposed. Not because it was elegant, but because it was legible everywhere. Bureaucrats could now read the same laws, record the same taxes, and issue the same commands from any corner of the empire. Meaning became uniform. And with uniform meaning came uniform obedience. Measurement followed. Before Qin, weights and measures varied by state and even by city. Trade was local. Accounting was inconsistent. Authority fractured at every transaction. Qin ended that. Lengths, volumes, weights, and currency were standardized. Bronze models were cast and distributed as references. Markets were recalibrated. Taxes were recalculated. The economy no longer belonged to regions. It belonged to the state. Infrastructure made this control physical. Roads were widened and straightened. Axle lengths were standardized so carts could move seamlessly across the empire. Canals connected distant regions. Information moved faster. Troops moved faster. Distance lost its defensive value. Law was next. Local customs were erased. Legal codes were unified and enforced without regard for tradition. Punishments were fixed. Responsibility was collective. Surveillance was embedded into daily life. The law did not care who you were. Only what you had done, or failed to report. This was not governance through persuasion. It was governance through inevitability. But the most controversial reform was not administrative. It was intellectual. The past itself had become dangerous. Confucian texts preserved alternative models of rule, ones that valued moral authority over legal force. Tradition over innovation. To Qin Shi Huang, these ideas were not harmless philosophy. They were seeds of fragmentation. So the emperor acted. Books were burned. Not all books, but the ones that preserved rival ways of thinking about power and society. History that glorified old kingdoms. Philosophy that questioned absolute authority. What remained were practical texts. Agriculture. Medicine. Divination. Knowledge that served the state survived. Knowledge that challenged it did not. Scholars who resisted faced punishment. Some were silenced. Some were executed. The message was unambiguous. The empire would not tolerate competing truths. This was not ignorance. It was control. Qin Shi Huang was not trying to erase knowledge. He was trying to erase choice. Because choice, in a unified empire, was instability. Uniformity was survival. Absolute power does not eliminate fear. It concentrates it. By the time Qin Shi Huang ruled everything under heaven, there was no enemy left to confront him. No rival state. No opposing army. No throne that could challenge his own. And yet, his sense of danger had never been greater. Because the final enemy was no longer external. It was time. Qin Shi Huang had spent his life watching rulers fall, not to armies. but to assassination, betrayal, illness, and decay. Kings were poisoned, emperors were stabbed, dynasties ended not with fire, but with a heartbeat that stopped too soon. Unification did not free him from this reality. It magnified it. Now, the empire depended entirely on his continued existence. There was no succession system strong enough to replace him, no tradition old enough to stabilize what he had built. If he died, everything he created could unravel. And so fear became policy. Palace life turned inward, movements were concealed. Schedules changed constantly. Assassination attempts, real or rumored, reinforced his vigilance. Trust narrowed until almost no one remained inside it. Even sleep became dangerous. The emperor began to move endlessly, traveling across the empire he had unified, not as a tour of triumph, but as evasion. Never staying too long in one place, never allowing routines to form. Stability, for others, was safety. For him, it was exposure. But fear alone does not sustain a ruler. It corrodes him. And Qin Shi Huang sought a solution that no system could provide. Immortality. If death was the ultimate threat, then defeating death became the ultimate goal. Alchemists were summoned. Taoist mystics promised elixirs brewed from rare minerals and cosmic forces. Mountains and seas were searched for islands of immortals. Expeditions were launched toward the eastern oceans, chasing rumors of eternal life. The emperor listened, not because he was foolish, but because he was desperate. He funded quests that drained resources and lives. He consumed substances meant to preserve him, but which slowly poisoned him instead. Mercury, believed to grant longevity, entered his body daily. The irony was complete. In attempting to escape death, he accelerated it. And yet, even as his body weakened, his obsession with permanence only grew. If his life could not be eternal, then his presence would be. He ordered the construction of a tomb unlike anything ever attempted, an underground empire mirroring the one above. Rivers of mercury flowing through sculpted landscapes, a ceiling of stars, an army of clay soldiers to guard him forever. The Terracotta Army was not art. It was insurance. A final assertion of control beyond death. When Qin Shi Huang finally died, it was not in his capital, but on the road. Still moving, still evading, still refusing to be still. His death was concealed. The empire was kept ignorant until his body could be returned. Even in death, secrecy remained essential. The man who unified China could not face the one fate he could not unify against. Time. His empire would not last. But its structure would. Long after the Qin dynasty collapsed, its systems remained: centralization, bureaucracy, standardization, the idea of a single ruler over a single, unified land. Qin Shi Huang failed to conquer death, but he succeeded in reshaping history. And that victory would outlive him. Empires built around a single will face a single test. What happens when that will disappears? When Qin Shi Huang died, the empire did not collapse immediately. There was no sudden rebellion, no instant uprising, no visible fracture. On the surface, order remained. That was the final illusion of Qin. His death was concealed. The court moved in silence. Officials followed protocol. Decrees were issued as if the emperor still lived. The machinery continued to operate, because it had been designed to do exactly that. But beneath the surface, something essential was missing. Direction. Qin Shi Huang had been more than a ruler. He had been the central stabilizing force of a system that tolerated no deviation. Every command ultimately traced back to him. Every fear converged on his presence. Without him, authority did not disperse. It drifted. Succession was immediate, but weak. The throne passed to Qin Shi, a ruler shaped not by war, but by palace intrigue. His authority was inherited, not forged, and in a system that respected only power. Inheritance was fragile. Real control fell to those closest to him. Courtiers, eunuchs, ministers who understood the machinery, but not the burden of commanding it. Decisions became reactive. Fear replaced clarity. Punishment replaced strategy. The empire still looked strong, but it had lost its spine. Local officials sensed the shift. Orders arrived late. Contradictions appeared. Enforcement became inconsistent. The absolute certainty that had once defined Qin law began to crack. And where certainty cracks, opportunity enters. The Qin state had been designed to suppress rebellion through speed and terror. But terror required credibility, and credibility required confidence at the center. That confidence was gone. For the first time since unification, the empire hesitated. And hesitation, in a system built on inevitability, was fatal. Empires rarely collapse from the top alone. They break when pressure from above meets resistance from below. For years, the Qin state had relied on fear to maintain order. Laws were strict, punishments were immediate. Collective responsibility ensured that disobedience spread consequences faster than rebellion could spread courage. But fear has a limit. When suffering becomes constant, fear loses its edge. Across the empire, ordinary people carried the full weight of Qin efficiency. Farmers were conscripted for massive construction projects. Roads, walls, palaces, and tombs consumed labor endlessly. Taxes were fixed. Deadlines were absolute. Failure was punished without context. There was no flexibility. And no mercy. Then came delay. A small one. A group of conscripted soldiers, delayed by storms and floods, realized something terrifying. According to Qin law, lateness was punishable by death. Not desertion. Not rebellion. Delay. In that moment, the law achieved the opposite of its intention. If death was inevitable, obedience lost its value. The men chose rebellion, not out of ideology, but out of logic. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang did not begin as revolutionaries. They were not philosophers. They were not generals. They were peasants and soldiers trapped by an inflexible system. Their uprising was small at first, but it carried a message that spread faster than Qin armies could march. The law could no longer frighten people who had nothing left to lose. Villages rose. Garrisons defected. Weapons were seized. Old resentments found direction. For the first time since unification, fear reversed direction. The state feared the people. Qin's response was force, but it was uneven. Orders conflicted. Commanders hesitated. Supplies faltered. The machine that once crushed resistance with precision now moved too slowly. Local officials, sensing weakness, chose survival. Some joined the rebels. Others pretended loyalty while waiting. Rebellion multiplied. Not because it was organized, but because it was contagious. What followed was not a single uprising, but a chain reaction. Regional leaders declared independence. Former nobles reclaimed titles. Old kingdoms returned in name, if not in strength. The illusion of permanence shattered. The Qin system had been designed to suppress disorder, not to absorb it. When pressure exceeded design limits, the structure cracked everywhere at once. The rebellion from below did not destroy Qin by itself, but it made survival impossible. When the Qin Empire finally collapsed, it did not do so with grandeur. There was no final stand worthy of legend. There was only exhaustion. As rebellions multiplied, the court retreated into confusion. Qin Shi ruled in name, but authority fractured between ministers who feared one another more than they feared the enemy. Orders contradicted. Punishments escalated. Trust evaporated. The state responded as it always had, with force. But force without coherence is noise. Armies marched without coordination. Garrisons defected mid-campaign. Supplies failed to arrive. Each response arrived too late, aimed at a crisis that had already moved elsewhere. The empire was reacting, not commanding. In desperation, the court intensified repression. Executions increased. Collective punishments widened. But terror, once diluted, could no longer restore obedience. It only accelerated collapse. Within a few years of the first emperor's death, the Qin dynasty was finished. The ruler was deposed. The capital fell. The name, Qin, once synonymous with inevitability, became a warning. And yet, the end of Qin was not the end of its influence. The men who destroyed the dynasty did not dismantle its structure. They fought over it. The centralized bureaucracy remained. The commandery system survived. Standardized laws, writing, and measurements endured. Even the concept of a single ruler over a unified land was no longer questioned. Qin had fallen, but the idea of empire had won. Later dynasties would soften its brutality. They would cloak authority in ritual and morality. They would speak of harmony instead of fear. But beneath those layers, the Qin foundation remained. The paradox of Qin Shi Huang is this. His dynasty was short-lived. His system was not. He failed to create a lasting family line. but he succeeded in creating a lasting political reality. The blood-soaked order he imposed could not survive unchanged. But it could not be undone. The first emperor did not conquer time, but he defined what came after him. And in that sense, his shadow never left China. The Qin dynasty is remembered in extremes. It is remembered as ruthless. And it is remembered as foundational. These two truths are not separate. They are inseparable. The power of Qin was built on policies that tolerated no resistance. Law was absolute. Punishment was collective. Mercy was not a virtue. It was a risk. Weapons were confiscated and melted down, not only to disarm the population, but to eliminate the possibility of future war. Knowledge that challenged authority was destroyed. Books were burned. Scholars who refused to submit were silenced, some buried alive, others erased from public memory. The state did not merely rule bodies. It sought to rule thought. Labor was extracted at unprecedented scale. Millions were conscripted for walls, roads, palaces, and tombs. Deadlines were unforgiving. Failure was criminal. Suffering was not an accident of policy. It was the policy. These measures achieved what centuries of war had failed to do. They ended fragmentation. But they did so at a cost so severe that the system could not survive without its creator. And yet, when Qin collapsed, its ideas did not. The dynasty fell. The structure remained. The greatest legacy of Qin was not conquest, but standardization. For the first time, a vast territory shared a single written script. Regional variations were eliminated. Orders could be read and enforced anywhere. Administration became possible at imperial scale. Weights and measures were unified. Length, volume, mass, and currency followed common standards. Trade stabilized. Taxation became consistent. The economy became legible to the state. Infrastructure connected regions that had once been isolated. Roads, canals, and standardized axle widths collapsed distance. The empire could move information, goods, and armies as a single organism. These were not symbolic achievements. They were functional. Later dynasties rejected Qin's cruelty, but embraced its systems. They softened the law, moralized authority, and wrapped power in ritual. But they did not abandon centralization, bureaucracy, or standardization. They could not. China after Qin could no longer return to a world of competing scripts, measures, and sovereigns. That door was closed. The Qin dynasty lasted only 15 years. Its legacy has lasted more than 2,000. Qin Shi Huang failed to create a lasting dynasty. But he succeeded in creating a lasting framework for civilization. A framework born in violence and carried forward in order.